The people of Felton Continent are naturally belligerent and powerful, with the Montes dominating the continent for many years due to their innate advantage genes. Because the genes of beasts flow in the blood of the Monte people, they often erupt in struggles until they knock each other down. Susu traveled through time, and as soon as she opened her eyes, she saw a group of women dressed as savages, and she suddenly froze in place. Alex, as the leader of the Monte tribe, sat casually on the throne, watching the people below the steps fight for women until a white figure caught his eye. The environment was harsh, food was scarce, and a man occasionally came out to find something to show his presence. Susu, who was delicate and weak, couldn't help but silently shed tears. Mary Sullivan, the female lead, is not distracted. The background of the story is similar to the primitive wilderness and fictional era. The male protagonist is the strongest in mainland China, with a paranoid and crazy personality. He is known for taking and plundering, and does not want to enter unless he likes it. Keywords of the novel. Soft Girls Wilderness Survival Diary. No pop-ups. Soft Girls Wilderness Survival Diary Complete Collection Download. Soft Girls Wilderness Survival Diary Latest Chapter Reading. Chapter 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Susu works as an intern in a community, working 9 to 5 every day, and is a standard social animal. After finishing work that evening, she returned to the rental room. In the misty shower, a graceful woman wearing a loose white nightgown stood in front of the mirror. She lifted her fair and delicate fingers and gently wiped away the water droplets on the mirror. In a moment, a delicate and alluring face appeared in the mirror. The night is gradually getting dark. The summer night was long, and cicadas were shouting one after another outside the window. The girl on the bed slowly fell asleep. Felton Continent. The territory of the Montes is located in the mountains south of the Malone Forest. The people of the Monte tribe all live in caves. At a glance, countless caves of all sizes were created on the surrounding mountains, and the open space surrounded by the mountains was the range of activity for Montessori cubs. The scorching and bright bonfire illuminated the Monte people singing and dancing in the darkness, and members of the hunting team safely returned to the tribe and brought back many prey. Jia is a warrior from the tribe. He was gnawing on the barbecue when he suddenly felt his shoulders sink. He turned around and saw the female warrior Chinya from the tribe looking at him with a smile on her face. Jia nodded and said hello. Chinya is an outstanding female warrior and a member of their hunting team. The woman had a tall and straight figure, and her wheat-colored skin added a hint of charm to her. She sat beside Jia casually and said, the two of them started fighting for a slave this time. Men have high levels of hormones and well-developed muscles, and if they don't agree, they will start a duel. The female slaves of the tribe were all tribute from other tribes, mainly used to serve those brave warriors. Jia let out a light he was not interested in those lowly and weak slaves, and looked up at the throne above the steps not far away. The man on the throne is Alex, the leader of the Monte tribe, and the strongest on the continent. The man has a dazzling golden curly short hair, a handsome face like a god, a tall and strong figure, and his exposed wide shoulders and narrow waist make the female servants around him drool. At this moment, he is closing his eyes and recuperating, seemingly unaware of the blood-splattering tribe below. Ah! A crack seemed to have torn open in the quiet night sky. Alex suddenly opened his eyes. His vision was excellent, and even in the dark, he could clearly see a young girl in a white dress standing in front of the grass and trees. The man's gaze was sharp, his green eyes staring straight at the pale face of the girl. For a moment, he sat up straight. Jia saw the leader suddenly stand up, his eyes slightly tense, and then he saw the leader quickly running towards the grass and trees in front of him. On the other side, Susu's body trembled with fear as she looked at the gray monster bird in front of her with fearful eyes. Her brain is in chaos. What the hell is going on here? How could she open her eyes in the wilderness when she was sleeping in bed? And those two men dressed as savages. Is that a martial arts competition? Squeak. The strange bird in front of the girl suddenly let out a piercing cry, and its dark red eyes blinked for a moment before flapping its wings and attacking Susu's face. Susu saw its sharp mouth attacking her and wanted to escape immediately, but her body stiffened in fear and couldn't move a single bit. She closed her eyes with a face as pale as ashes. After an unknown amount of time, the girl's eyelashes trembled lightly and she slowly opened her eyes. In front of her stood a tall and leggy man, his face hidden in the darkness. With the moonlight, Susu could only see his deep green eyes. Susu was still in shock and nervously "Thank you. Thank you." The next second, the man lowered his eyes and squeezed his hand, causing the strange bird's head to fall to the ground. As Susu's pupils contracted, her small face turned pale and she quietly took a step back. Strange scenes, eerie men. A hint of confusion flashed in the girl's eyes as she forcefully pinched her wrist. "Hiss, it hurts so much, it's not a dream." The man's eyes darkened and his steps lifted. Susu caught a glimpse of his movements in her spare time, and a hint of caution flashed in her eyes. "Who are you?" As soon as she finished speaking, her body suddenly soared into the air. The man carried her on his shoulder and strode towards the cave. Susu's face was facing downwards, and the strong and developed muscles on the man's shoulders made her furrow her fine eyebrows and say, "Who are you? Let me down. Did you hear me?" The tribe members cheered as they saw the leader carrying a thin and fair-skinned woman back to the cave. The woman's long black hair covered her face, and Jie only saw her struggling calves, fair and slender, not as thick as his arms. Jie raised his eyebrows. He didn't expect the leader to like this type of woman. Alex placed her on his stone bed, his hands resting on the girl's shoulders and neck, his gaze fixed on her face with a heavy gaze. Susu gave him a push, but didn't push. The man rubbed her face with his big hand, and a low, slightly hoarse voice sounded, "Amp, #NAMP. Susu listened to the unfamiliar language and her heart sank. She turned her head and shook off the man's big hand, asking, "Where is this?" The man realized that their language was not compatible, and his heroic eyebrows furrowed before saying, #BA-AMP. He then grabbed onto Susu's nightgown. Susu hurriedly ran outside the cave, only to be caught halfway back. Alex held her waist with one hand, her skin soft and boneless, even more delicate than the newborn offspring of the tribe. He rolled his Adam's apple and lifted his other hand to pinch the back of the girl's neck, sternly saying, "If you keep arguing, I'll throw you to the Li tribe." The Li ethnic group is famous on the mainland for their cannibalism. Susu dared not move when she saw the man getting angry. Alex saw that the girl had finally calmed down, and he tugged at her nightgown. With a tear-pull sound, Susu looked at her shoulder with a big tear in her heart, and a surge of anger surged in her heart. The girl looked at the man with a hint of lust in her eyes, and without hesitation, she gave him a hard slap in the face. Alex's body paused, his cold eyes narrowed slightly, and the girl in front of him was staring at him with disgust, as if he were something dirty. The man's tongue pressed against the beaten right face, and his emotions were unclear in his eyes, with a fierce and domineering aura that was too imposing to speak. Susu felt scared after realizing it, and before she could speak, she was grabbed by someone's neck. Breathing became weak, and her vision was blurred by tears. Inexplicably, Susu suddenly thought of the fate of that strange bird. Later, her lovely head would also roll to the ground, right? The girl's crystal-clear tears streaked the corners of her eyes. Alex saw a woman cry for the first time, and he pursed his thin lips before releasing his big hand. Before Susu could breathe a sigh of relief, she was flipped over by him and immediately caught a cold. She blushed and pulled up the dress rolled up to her back, saying, "Cough cough cough. Cough 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 cough. What a pervert." Alex saw that there was no mark of companionship on her back, and his eyes flickered before he bent down and leaned into her shoulder. The hot air between the man's breath sprayed onto her back, and Susu heard his slightly rapid breathing. She was just about to stand up with her hands propped up on the stone bed when someone hugged her in front of her. The next second, a severe pain came from the shoulder. The girl's face was wrinkled into a ball, and she only felt a darkness before losing consciousness. Blood flowed down the weak shoulder of the young girl, and the man raised his eyes slightly. A breathtaking madness appeared in his green eyes. Alex bent down and licked the bloodstains on the girl's shoulder and neck, and finally got her. No one knew that the first time he saw this petite and beautiful woman, his whole body was crazily clamoring to possess her, crush her, and make her look only at him. Alex never had a woman after reaching adulthood. There are also women in the tribe who have plump figures and good looks, but Alex has no feelings for them, and the witch doctor often worries about his sexual orientation. A glance from the woman in his arms can make his blood boil uncontrollably. Alex touched his chest. Just holding her, Alex could feel his heart, which used to have no ups and downs, trembling rapidly at this moment. It's really a strange thing. Alex's cold eyes flashed with a hint of imperceptible inquiry, and he could feel that the girl had no feelings for him. However, he doesn't care. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Susu could hear the laughter of children as soon as she realized it. The girl slowly opened her eyes and looked around to find herself in a spacious and bright cave. The walls around her were still adorned with wild animal fangs, and there were some strangely shaped clay jars on the ground. Susu glanced at the animal skin beneath her, and her breath was filled with the scent of a man's body. The faint scent of male hormones filled the entire cave. The wound on her shoulder constantly reminded her that everything that happened last night was not an illusion. She really traveled. Susu has an introverted personality and enjoys reading novels on a daily basis. She is quite helpless in the current situation. She likes time travel novels, but doesn't want to experience time travel on her own. Judging from the attire of those people, she couldn't have worn it to the savage tribe, could she? Thinking of the living environment of those primitive tribes online, the girl nervously pursed her lips and slowly crawled out of bed. The amber sunset shines on the earth, and all things in the world are bathed in this golden light. The ancient trees droop, and the greenery is strong. Susu stood in front of the cave, looking at the people coming and going ahead. Both men and women are tall. She was lost in thought when suddenly a group of strong men appeared at the mountain pass ahead, carrying prey on their shoulders. The leader had a handsome face and a cold expression, and his cold phoenix eyes instantly locked onto Susu's position. The girl was dressed in a white dress, with a fairy-like appearance, bright eyes and white teeth, standing outside the crowd like a glowing body. The people around her looked at her with curious eyes, discussing. You're so short, aren't you still a minor? That face is really beautiful. So thin and weak, can you give birth to offspring? Can you bear the leader's waist? My chest is not as big as mine. Alex had no expression on his face and strode towards the girl. Susu's heart tightened upon seeing this, and she immediately ran towards the mountain pass. I was grabbed by someone halfway. The man's hand was very strong, with bulging veins like an iron arm tightly restraining her arm. Her pained little face wrinkled into a ball, and she patted the back of the man's hand with her other hand. Let go. You let go. Alex smelled the sweet fragrance again, lowered his eyes, and let go of his hand. Susu immediately took 2 steps back and moved away from him. Her wrist was already red and there was a faint feeling of pain. #. The man's deep and hoarse voice rang out the next second. Susu saw the man looking down at her and then putting on a necklace for her. The necklace is composed of several colorful crystal stones and wolf teeth, and looks extremely exquisite. The people around them took a deep breath when they saw the leader wearing a beautiful and luxurious necklace for the foreign race. Crystal stones are a rare resource in Felton Continent, and have always been dominated by the water snake clan on the East Bay Sea. It is not easy to take crystal stones from them. The leader is willing to put in so much effort for this half-disabled woman. Yes, a half-disabled woman. The male warriors of Felton Continent also prioritize women with strong physique and fertility when selecting partners. In order to breed stronger offspring, the young girl has an outstanding appearance, but her slender figure makes her somewhat thin compared to the women of the Monte tribe. The men who were originally restless also hesitated at this moment, with thin arms and legs, fragile like crystal stones. The ancestors should let the leader serve her. Susu took off the things from her neck and handed them to him. She doesn't want it. Alex didn't answer, and a hint of displeasure flashed in his eyes. Then he bent down and hugged her back to the cave. Alex is a full 1.9 meters tall, and his stone bed is 3 to 4 meters wide, which can accommodate 6 to 7 people to rest on. The man sat on the bed, quietly sniffing the breath of the person in his arms. Susu was sitting on his lap, her strength far inferior to him, and she couldn't even struggle. She was both angry and anxious, tightly gripping the man's arm. Alex's eyes were faint, and the pain emanating from his arms was negligible, causing him to feel an itch in his heart. He turned the young girl in his arms around, and as he expected, her delicate eyebrows had already furrowed into a ball. Such rejection of his closeness. The man's gaze was deep, and he reached for the girl's back with his big hand. A hint of panic flashed in Susu's eyes, and she felt a little scared. "What are you doing?" Alex couldn't understand what she was saying, and he gently caressed the bite marks left from last night. His fingers were rough, and the warm touch of his fingertips came clearly, causing goosebumps to rise on Susu's body. The girl's body became increasingly stiff, and she didn't forget the fierce look on her neck when this person pinched her last night. At this moment, a burst of cheers came from outside the cave, and the man held her with one hand and strode out of the dimly lit cave. As night fell, the Monte people also began to revel. Alex sat on the throne holding Susu, while the Monte people below him were enjoying tonight's dinner in large gulps. The slaves, dressed in revealing clothes, were shuttling through the crowd to serve the energetic and strong men. Susu was placed on the leader's throne by Alex, and her almond eyes were filled with shock. The man withdrew his gaze. He didn't know what was on his mind, and then he grabbed it with a big hand. Susu was startled by his sudden movements. She could feel the scorching gaze coming from above her head, and at that moment, there was also an ambiguous kiss coming from below the steps. Susu immediately held her breath, afraid to move. Alex saw that her ears were already red, and his eyes lit up. Then, as if admiring a beautiful artwork, he gently rubbed her face with his big hands. The man has a burly physique and his usual appetite should not be underestimated. This time, the barbecue in front of him remained motionless, as if he was only interested in the face of the person in his arms. His phoenix eyes were playfully observing the reactions of the person in his arms. "Gulu." A faint voice suddenly rang out. Susu listened to her stomach scream, and the resistance that was originally held in the man's arms disappeared in an instant. Instead, it was an indescribable awkwardness, and she dared not look up at the man's reaction. Alex had no expression on his face as he picked up the grilled meat from the stone table and handed it to Susu's mouth. Susu pondered for 2 seconds before taking a bite. The next second, she spat out a small piece of grilled meat from her mouth on the ground. Alex frowned and took a big bite. The fresh meat was juicy and delicious as usual. He didn't understand why this thin and weak woman would vomit. Susu saw him chewing on the blood-stained flesh with a joyful expression on his face. She frowned, and in the next second, a green fruit was stuffed into her palm. Susu didn't eat, and the emotions of the people around him had already risen, as if someone was fighting. Alex tried to touch the cheek of the person in his arms after finishing the barbecue, but his hand was hit halfway through. Pop. The man's phoenix eyes narrowed, and the girl in his arms stared at him with a wary and guarded expression. Susu stared at his hands, which were covered in oil and blood, and she felt a pang of nausea in her heart. Her disdainful gaze fell squarely into Alex's eyes. After a moment, the man let out a cold snort and picked up the girl in his arms, heading straight back to the cave. A foreign woman who still has the courage to despise him. Alex became the first warrior of the Monte tribe as an adult and later became the leader of the Monte tribe. Strong strength, handsome and outstanding appearance, coupled with high status and power, made the women in the tribe eager to climb onto his bed. However, men have extremely high standards and have not yet chosen a partner. Alex looked down at the frightened girl on the bed and remained silent. This slender, fair-skinned woman was his own pet or slave. The man touched the girl's shiny black hair with his big hand, and the smooth and cool touch made him unable to put it down. The woman in front of him, from her hair to the soles of her feet, is the most beautiful gift from heaven. Alex did not deny that he would feel an impulse whenever he saw that delicate face, but her frail figure clearly did not give birth to a tribal heir for him. A hint of regret flashed in the man's eyes as he casually threw the coarse linen cloth wrapped around his hips onto the nearby slate, and then lay down on the bed. Susu suddenly saw the man's naked body, her nervous brain blank, and she quickly averted her gaze. The man lay facing her by the bed, his deep blue eyes staring at her without blinking. Neither of them spoke, and the atmosphere became somewhat quiet for a moment. In the darkness, she couldn't see his expression clearly. She placed her hands on her chest and stared at him cautiously. Alex looked at her for a while and then closed his eyes. The little pet had a high level of vigilance, and he didn't know which tribe it belonged to. After an unknown amount of time, a man's soft breathing came from beside him. Susu licked her dry lips and tentatively reached out her hand to cross over the man's body. However, she accidentally pressed onto the man's knee, causing her to lose her footing and fall off the bed in a daze. With a loud bang inadequate starting point, Susu slightly moved her body and instinctively looked up at the unconscious man on the bed. Then she tiptoed out of the cave, and when she left, she began to run wildly towards the forest. She didn't know where to go, but she couldn't stay by the side of this perverted and exposed maniac. In the cave, the man on the stone bed was now looking at the shattered crystal necklace on the ground with a sinister expression on his face. In a moment, he stood up and picked up the wolf fang from the fragments. Alex put away his wolf fangs, and when he looked up again, his expression had returned to normal. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. The night gradually deepened, and from time to time, a few insect calls could be heard in the lush forest. The hazy moonlight suddenly cast a layer of white veil over this dense forest. Susu ran for a while before stopping. She looked around and found herself on a piece of grass. The night breeze in early summer was still a bit cool, so Susu held her hands in front of her chest and slowly walked towards the nearby cave. For a moment, Susu stood at the entrance of the cave. The pitch-black cave looked like a monster's open mouth, and if she stepped further, it would be swallowed into her stomach. At this moment, a smell of dry animal feces mixed with the soil rushed towards her. Susu instinctively covered her nose, frowned, and did not walk further inside. It seems that no one has lived here for a long time. Roar, roar. A deafening roar of the bear suddenly came from behind. Susu's pupils suddenly shrank upon hearing the sound, and she looked back stiffly. She saw a black bear standing 3 or 4 meters tall in the bushes ahead, with fierce eyes and a grin on her face, running towards her. A hint of fear flashed in the girl's eyes, and she took a slight step back before ignoring it and starting to run away. The black bear was very fast. When it saw its prey running away, it angrily smashed the rocks at the entrance of the cave and quickly chased after it. Susu's face turned pale. While running, she accidentally stumbled over a tree trunk on the ground and fell to the ground. At this point, the black bear had already caught up. Her hand was scratched by a stone, and blood rushed out in an instant. The black bear smelled the bloody smell of its prey, and it became even more excited. Its sharp teeth eagerly bit the prey's arm. A hint of despair gradually rose in Susu's heart. She never imagined that one day she would become a dish for the bear. She slowly closed her eyes. The expected pain did not occur, and she seemed to hear the tragic roar of the bear. The girl's eyelashes trembled lightly before slowly opening her eyes. The black bear, who had just opened its teeth and waved its claws, had already been shot to the ground by someone. The attacker had a heavy attack and used a stone knife to directly pierce through the bear's thick brain. The person turned their back to the moonlight and looked down at the Susu on the ground from a high position. After Susu saw his face clearly, she immediately widened her eyes. "It's actually Alex." She lowered her head and pursed her lips, saying softly, "Thank you for saving me." Only then did she realize that they didn't speak the same language. Alex's eyes were faint as he bent down. Susu felt a shadow covering her head, and when she looked up, she saw the person extending their arm. She thought Alex was here to help her, so she quickly stood up and said, "Thank you for your kindness. I can stand up on my own." The man didn't speak. He picked up the black bear next to him and walked ahead. Susu. Fortunately, he couldn't understand. Alex walked towards the tribe without looking back. There was a hint of hesitation on Susu's face, and she stood still. She doesn't want to go back with this person, but she's not familiar with the place and doesn't have a place to go. Moreover, she hasn't found a way to go home yet. Alex took a few steps to see that she didn't keep up, then turned around and looked at her with a deep gaze. The dress on the girl's body was a bit messy. She lowered her head slightly, her slender eyebrows furrowed into a ball, and her porcelain white face looked even more charming in the moonlight. Alex spoke out, "Keep up." Susu looked up at the sound and saw his stern expression. Although she didn't understand what the person was saying, she could also tell that he was feeling a bit irritable. After some thought, she followed along. After returning to the tribe, Alex handed the black bear over to the night patrol warrior, and then he whispered a few commands to the nearby tribe. Susu looked back at the tribe member with a surprised expression on her face. Afterwards, the tribe member walked towards Susu. The tribe member stood in front of Susu, staring without blinking at the topic of discussion among the brave warriors in the tribe recently. The girl tilted her head slightly and looked at herself with a bewildered expression on her face. The tribe members looked at this beautiful face up close for the first time, and the night wind struck. The light fragrance on the girl's body drifted to his nose, and in the next second, a domineering masculine aura replaced the faint fragrance. This is. The breath on the leader's body. Are the two already married? No, this aura is very faint and disappears in an instant. This is a declaration of sovereignty. After the tribe members understood, they moved their gaze away and said in a deep voice, "You can stay in the slave hole in the future." After speaking, she still looked puzzled. The clan member repeated, "From now on, you will live in the slave hole." Susu whispered, "What do you mean by that?" The girl's crisp and pleasant voice lingered in her ears, and the tribe finally realized that the unfamiliar tone in her mouth was not the language of the Felton Continent. Afterwards, the tribe member waved at Susu, gesturing for her to follow her. Susu instinctively looked at Alex, and he left here expressionless. The tribe was still urging, but Susu slowly walked over. In a moment, Susu was taken to a dim cave. She glanced at the people inside the cave and asked the tribe member, "Is this?" Before she could finish speaking, she saw that the tribe member had already locked the wooden door of the cave. Susu's eyes were taken aback, and she quickly ran over and said, "What are you doing? Open the door." The tribe just waved their hands at her and left here. Susu was a bit angry, and she also realized that it was all Alex's instructions. That perverted and exposed maniac actually wants to lock her up. Restricting her personal freedom for no reason. Did she have a brain tumor? She was angry and suddenly heard a soft male voice say. #. Susu noticed that after the young man finished speaking, other people in the cave also looked at him with crazy eyes. A hint of panic flashed in her eyes, and she took a slight step back, moving away from these people. The people in the cave were all looking at the new slave, their scorching and explicit eyes fixed on Susu, and some even noticed her dress. Susu saw them surrounding her, so she stepped back to the door and hugged herself tightly. "Don't come over." In an instant, this group of people surrounded Susu. Susu squatted on the ground, holding her chest with both hands. The next second, someone grabbed her sleeve. "It's the boy who just spoke out." Hansen saw a panicked expression on the beautiful face of the young girl, and a hint of jealousy flashed in his eyes before disappearing in an instant. His hands gradually exerted a strong force, indicating that he was peeling off his plain clothes. At this moment, Susu also recognized that this young man was the one who boldly sought pleasure at the bonfire party before. She looked around at the expressions of the people around her and then asked softly, "Do you like this dress?" Hansen stopped immediately when he heard her voice. "Hansen, what did she say? This woman is not from the Monte tribe. She's so beautiful, bah. Nonsense. She's so weak, how could she be from the Monte tribe? However, she has the scent of the Montes on her body." As soon as these words were spoken, people around took a step back. It was only then that everyone noticed a faint masculine aura permeating the air. Hansen glanced suspiciously at Susu, wondering if this person was really the companion of the Montes. To be on the safe side, Hansen turned his head and said to the people in the slave hole, "Everyone go back and stay." After listening, everyone sat in their respective positions, and they sat together in groups of 3 or 2, their eyes occasionally drifting towards Susu and the others. It seems that the young man in front of them is their leader. Susu blinked her eyes and looked at the boy in front of her and said, "My name is Susu." Hansen is not sure, so Susu gestured and Hansen finally understood. He said in a deep voice, "Hansen." For a moment, the girl's strange and convoluted tone blurted out, "Hansen." Hansen is a member of the Green Snake tribe. He is not as handsome and tough as other men. He has had fair skin since childhood and has an outstanding appearance. The tribe often jokes that he is like a woman, and Hansen is also slightly proud of this. 3 months ago, the Monte tribe captured the Green Snake tribe, and the surviving women in the tribe became slaves to the Monte people. There is an unwritten rule in Felton Continent that when 2 tribes engage in battle, the victorious can freely execute the defeated tribe members. The men of the Green Snake tribe have all been executed to death. Only Hansen was left behind due to his resemblance to a woman. At the beginning, the women of the Green Snake tribe were crying and crying. Hansen stood up and told everyone that a new life should be started. The Monte tribe was the hegemon of the continent, with strong combat power and sufficient food. Being slaves here would not lead to hunger, and the food obtained from the Green Snake tribe would be better than before. They go out to pick trees and fruits during the day, and come back at night to play with those men. The Montes hold a bonfire party every night, and Hansen and the others shuttle through it. The Montes are very generous and give them meat chunks. After Susu finished speaking, she saw Hansen squatting in a corner of the wall, without any intention of paying attention to her anymore. Susu looked around and found a corner, waiting quietly for dawn. After an unknown amount of time, Susu heard a soft female voice and slowly opened her eyes. The girl in front of her was wearing a messy head of hair, with a thin and weak figure and dark skin. She spoke words that Susu didn't understand. When Susu woke up, she handed her a backpack. Susu took it over in a daze, and the sunlight outside the cave made her unable to open her eyes. The girl turned around and left the cave. Susu saw that there was no one around, and she slowly walked out of the slave hole. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Susu walked out of the cave and found that everyone had gathered together, carrying baskets on their backs. She stood casually in the crowd, looking at the tall and sturdy Montes. Suddenly, she squinted her eyes. Bruce was counting the number of people when he caught a glimpse of a woman with long hair angrily walking towards him. Long hair, fair skin. Wait, why are you looking a bit familiar? After Bruce realized it, he quickly coughed twice and then took the slaves to the melon forest to pick. Susu saw that she was in front of the person who was closing her, and the next second she was pushed back by the crowd. She is 1.6 meters tall, not to mention the height of the Montes. Even the average height of the weak fighting members of the Green Snake tribe is 1.7 meters. Susu was short and caught in the crowd, inevitably being bumped into by others. Gradually, she slowed down and walked behind the crowd. Bruce took the lead and dared not turn back. Susu's gaze was fixed on Bruce. She didn't notice her feet for a moment and almost fell. Fortunately, she was helped by someone beside her. It's the girl who gave her a basket just now. Susu raised her lips and smiled at her. The girl looked at her and quickly lowered her head. It seems like I'm a bit afraid of her. Susu looked at the corner of the girl's mouth and smiled. She gestured gently and said, "My name is Susu." After a while, the girl whispered back, "Nancy." Susu repeated softly, "Nancy." She spoke the language of the Felton Continent a bit awkward, and then Susu praised it in her hometown dialect, "Your name sounds really nice." Nancy carefully observed the faces of the people around her, and then quietly blushed in her ears. After exchanging names, the two naturally walked together. From the tribe to the Marone forest, there is a distance. In the scorching summer, the scorching sun shines like fire, and the lush trees in the sky provide people with a cool place everywhere. After walking for a while, Susu felt a pain in her soles. She wiped the sweat off her forehead and then placed her backpack on the ground. Nancy was puzzled when she suddenly stopped walking. She looked at the large army in front of her and whispered, "Are you okay?" Susu saw her caring expression on her face, and she roughly guessed what Nancy was saying. Then she shook her head and repeated what Nancy had just said. Nancy across from her suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of responsibility when she saw the girl stumbling and learning to speak on her own. From then on, Nancy began to intentionally teach Susie the language of the continent of Felton, and Susie was very grateful for it. The two became friends like this. After giving instructions to these slaves, Bruce stood by and closely monitored them. He looked around and found Susu under the tree. Seeing the girl laughing happily with the person beside him, Bruce scratched his head in confusion. Nancy placed her backpack on the ground, climbed up the tree with both hands and feet, and then threw the fruits from the book onto the ground. Susu stood aside and began picking up fruits on the ground. "The fruit in front of me has a hard and prickly shell like a durian, but its color is actually purple." The girl curiously reached out her hand and picked it up, ready to put it in the side basket frame. "Who? It's quite heavy." Susu bit her teeth secretly, then bent down and finally put the fruit into the frame. "This fruit occupies a large part of the basket at this moment." Nancy walked over. She saw Susu struggling to hold on to Ganangwa, took a step forward, and then easily picked it up. Susu was somewhat surprised and said, "You have quite a lot of strength. This girl looks thin and weak, with considerable strength." As soon as they filled the frame, a group of unwelcome guests walked over. Hansen tilted his chin and said to Nancy, "The shape of the Canaanite fruit we picked this time is not full enough. Remember to be careful next time." After that, the women behind him snatched Susu's backpack. Susu saw that several people were not kind, so she took a cautious step back and tightly held onto her backpack. Beside her, Nancy remained silent. The female slaves were very strong, and one of them tugged hard, pushing Susu to the ground. Hansen saw the young girl sitting on the ground with a disheveled face. He tugged at the corner of his mouth with satisfaction and then turned around to leave. After taking the fruits of the two, those people left. Susu patted the soil on her body and walked over to Nancy, holding her hand and silently comforting her. Nancy felt the warm and soft little hands of the girl, and hastily lifted her head. The girl next to her tilted her head slightly, and her delicate little face bloomed with a faint smile. "They are many, Let's not argue with them for now. Nancy stared earnestly at the girl, her numb and hollow eyes suddenly lit up under her messy hair. She tightly gripped Susu, as if she had grabbed a life-saving straw and never wanted to let go again. Susu was tightly held by the warm and rough hand. She felt a slight pain in her hand and wanted Nancy to release some of her strength. Her red lips parted slightly, and before she could say anything, she saw her wet little eyes. Colleen, helpless, clear paired with her dark skin, it looks a bit like her grandmother's little dog. Susu's heart softened for a moment. Forget it, just hold it if you want. Before sunset, everyone returned to the tribe. After returning to the tribe, the slaves handed over the harvested food and exchanged it for dinner. Hansen and his team exchanged Canaanites for several sweet fruits. And Susu got a big cake in exchange. The big pancake in her hand was about 10 centimeters wide and dark. The chef baked it hard and without much flavor. Susu slowly took a small sip. Didn't bite it off. The girl used both hands and bit hard, but still couldn't take it off. Susu rubbed her sour cheeks and then heard a hint of mockery. She heard the sound and saw Hansen and the others looking at her with disdain on their faces, as if saying she was useless. Susu was not angry either. She shrugged her shoulders casually, and Nancy next to her took her cake over. Then she took her to the river to soak it in the river water, and the black cake softened. Nancy handed it to her and said softly, "That's it." Susu remembered these few words from her, and now she can probably guess what Nancy is saying. However, looking at the slightly soft and rotten black cake soaked in it, Susu couldn't swallow it and placed it directly on the nearby stone slab. Nancy. Not eating. Susu nodded afterwards. She saw Nancy take it and ate it with relish. The rosy sunset reflects on the horizon, and after the return of the fully loaded warriors, it is the start of the Monte people's nightly revelry. Susu didn't want to attend the collective gathering, so she hid in the slave hole and didn't go out. In the dimly lit cave, the girl lay among the huge leaves, her eyes slightly closed as she thought about what had happened in the past few days. Suddenly, the door of the slave hole was opened by someone. Susu instantly opened her eyes and sat up to look at the newcomer. The light inside the cave was dim, and the visitor's face was hidden in the darkness. Susu carefully identified that the person was actually Hansen. Her heart sank instantly. Hansen walked straight to Susu and squatted down. He reached out and grabbed Susu's nightgown, looking as if he had taken it for himself. After Susu knew the purpose of this person's arrival, she frowned and pushed him away forcefully, smoothing the marks of the person holding Zoe. Hansen was suddenly pushed away by her, and a surge of anger surged in his heart. At this moment, he heard the girl say in broken Felton Continental common, "Exchange." Hansen's anger disappeared instantly. As soon as he lifted up his clothes, he saw the girl say, "I want new ones." Hansen paused for a moment before he realized that he was being despised. He gave the girl a fierce glare and then went to the corner to start searching for new clothes. In a moment, he walked over with a black long dress. Susu took the long dress and let the person walk out. Hansen's expression became increasingly impatient, and he cursed before standing outside the cave. Susu put on the long skirt he brought. The fabric of the skirt was rough, and it felt a bit prickly when worn. She had just finished changing when she heard Hansen open the door. This person disregarded Susu's presence and immediately changed into the white nightgown. Hansen is 1.7 meters tall, and wearing a skirt on him is too short to cover his thighs. There is no mention of wearing underwear on this continent. Susu remained silent as she faced the wall, her head lowered, making it difficult to see the expression on her face. On the other hand, Hansen changed his clothes and left satisfied. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Hansen wore plain clothes and went to the bonfire party. Along the way, he became even more proud when he saw the surprised gazes in people's eyes. He also noticed that some brave warriors of the Monte tribe were following him. Hansen held the roasted meat and lowered his head slightly, kneeling beside a strong warrior. The brave warrior hugged Hansen directly into his arms, and his hands began to touch him randomly. Hansen gently leaned against his embrace. Alex sat on the throne with a golden knife above the steps, casually eating the grilled meat on the leaves, while the female slaves beside him carefully cut the meat with small stone knives. At this moment, a seductive exclamation suddenly came from under the steps. Alex's eyebrows and eyes sank, and he looked over to see a familiar figure. The person was wearing a white dress, and his clothes were no longer covering his body. At this moment, he was being pulled by two men. The man's pupils suddenly shrank, he put down the piece of meat in his hand, stood up, and walked down the steps. Alex was already furious, and only when he walked up to the person did he realize he had mistaken them. Hansen was sandwiched before and after, and as he turned his head, he saw the leader of the Monte tribe standing aside. A hint of joy flashed in his eyes, and then he softly called out, "Leader." Alex then turned his gaze to his face, his brows and eyes cold, as he watched Hansen's face slowly turn red expressionlessly. He turned around and left when Hansen grabbed the cloth on his crotch, and a hint of violence flashed in Alex's eyes. "Leader, help me." Alex glanced at the clothes on his body, and for a moment, he tugged at Hansen's wrist. The two warriors who were originally in conflict immediately let go when their leader saw that they were interested in the slave. Hansen's smile spread, and a great sense of excitement attacked his mind. He didn't expect to be noticed by the leader, so he twisted his waist and threw himself into Alex's arms. Alex stepped back slightly and said, "Follow me." Hansen quickly stood up and said, "Yes." The two went to Alex's cave. After Hansen walked to the cave, he began to take off his clothes. Alex coldly said, "Stop first." Hansen obediently stopped moving, smiled obsequiously twice, and then heard Alex ask, "Where is she?" Hansen's expression was taken aback. "Who?" Alex impatiently pointed to his clothes, and Hansen finally understood who he was talking about. He honestly replied, "In the slave hole." After speaking for a long time, the man didn't speak. Hansen couldn't help but lift his head and take a glance. The tall figure of the man was hidden in the darkness, and his emotions were unclear in his eyes. "Come over," he said. For some reason, Hansen suddenly felt a sense of crisis in his heart. The sweat on his back stood up, and he knelt in front of Alex with stiff hands and feet. The next second, he was grabbed by the man's neck. His survival instinct made him instinctively break the big hand around his neck. The man's strength was immense, causing him a sore throat. Due to poor breathing, his face was already red and purple, and Hansen began to feel dizzy. Before his consciousness fell into darkness, he heard the man's disdainful words. "Are you also worthy?" Alex saw that the man had fainted, and his anger had not yet dissipated. As soon as he thought that this dirty man had taken her clothes and might even have seen through her body, Alex felt his blood boil all over his body. The veins on the back of the man's hand erupted, and a bloodthirsty red light flashed in his eyes. With a click sound, the head on his hand fell to the ground, and after the blood vessels on his neck broke, some red dots fell onto the man's sturdy arm. The head drenched in blood rolled twice and stopped at the entrance of the cave. Alex was panting heavily, his heart pounding in his chest as if about to jump out. After breathing steadily, he carried Hansen's body out of the cave and handed over his body parts to the witch doctor Kane. As night falls, the people of the tribe gather together to dance and eat meat. Alex lifted his head from his hand and went to the slave hole. The sound of the wooden door being opened suddenly tore open the silent night. Susu didn't move when she heard the sound, thinking that some woman had returned. The newcomer walked steadily and quickly stood behind Susu. Susu only then felt something was wrong. She turned around slightly and saw a tall figure. She was breathing for a moment, and just as she was about to stand up, she saw him throwing something next to her. Susu stood up and paused, what? She slowly looked over and saw scenes that she would never forget in her lifetime. The faint moonlight shone through the broken wooden door on the ground, and Susu clearly saw a person's head placed at her feet. With just one glance, the deceased's eyeballs had fallen somewhere, and the two black large holes suddenly imprinted in her mind. Susu was so scared that her whole body trembled. Her hands and feet were weak, and she crawled into the corner. Take it away. Take it away. Woo-woo. It's too scary. The killer is right in front of her. What should we do? What should we do? She hasn't lived enough yet. Sobbing Alex pursed his lips and heard her faint cries. He felt the heart in his chest start to ache, and this feeling came and went quickly. He lifted his feet and walked towards her. Susu caught a glimpse of him approaching, and her face turned pale with a flash of fear in her eyes. Don't kill me. Please. The man crouched in front of him, with a hint of confusion in his eyes. He spoke calmly and said, I have already solved him for you. From now on, he will never trouble you again. Susu could only understand the three words, you, me, he, and her mind was spinning rapidly, starting to guess who died. She covered her eyes and quietly looked at the skull through her fingers. The light was not good, and she couldn't recognize it even after looking for a long time. Alex said indifferently, he's wearing your clothes. I haven't even worn it. As soon as Susu spoke, her eyes widened. It's Hansen. How could this be? She hugged her arm tightly and secretly moved away from him. Alex was still feeling a bit depressed in his heart. He stared at the fair face of the girl for a while, then carried her back to his cave. On the way, Susu dared not move at all. She tried her best to reduce her sense of presence, but the coldness in her heart could not dissipate. In this primitive society, strong power is the power of speech, and these savages have no legal consciousness in their hearts. They can dispose of the lives of slaves at will. Just like tonight, if Hansen makes him unhappy, he can twist his neck without anyone pursuing him, or in other words, no one cares about the life or death of a slave. It was not until this moment that Susu realized what a cruel society she had come into. There were no police here, only a group of beasts standing at the top of the food chain, and no one would protect her. She can only protect herself. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Alex gently placed the girl on the stone bed. He glanced at the bloodstains on his arm and then left the cave. For a moment, he lay by the bed with steam all over his body. Susu was still trembling, and she tightly hugged herself, afraid to look up at the person next to her. The tall and robust man lay lazily on the bed, his handsome face hidden in the darkness. His dazzling green eyes stared straight at the young girl without saying a word, until she couldn't resist the exhaustion and fell asleep, before he gently leaned over. The next day, Susu woke up without seeing Alex. She moved her stiff arm and got out of bed. She went directly to the slave cave to find Nancy, but the cave was empty, and even yesterday's head was gone. Susu frowned and randomly grabbed a passerby, pointing in the direction of the slave hole and asking where they had gone. Jia looked at the girl in front of him, quietly listening to her speak broken common language. Crispy and raw, he rubbed his ears and replied in a deep voice, they went to wash the animal skins today. After saying that, she still had a bewildered expression on her face, obviously not understanding. Jia licked his cracked lips and pointed with a big hand. Susu followed his direction and vaguely saw a group of women. She thanked them and walked towards that direction. The summer breeze blew by, and the girl's long hair fluttered with the wind, her exposed skin white and dazzling. Jia's gaze lingered on her wrist for 2 seconds before continuing to patrol. When Susu arrived, Nancy was washing animal skins by the river. After absorbing water, the fur of the prey became heavier, and Susu helped Nancy hold the animal skin together. The women across from each other occasionally glanced at Susu, but no one dared to step forward and chat. Last night when they returned, they saw Hansen's head. The women were frightened and panicked. It is not yet known who did this, but they are certain that they cannot be separated from this foreign woman. Even Nancy, who has a good relationship with Susu, no one dares to talk up. After Susu helped Nancy wash it, the two of them spread the animal skin on a nearby stone slab. Susu looked around and found that there were not many people around. She whispered, "Why don't you run away?" After hearing her words, Nancy immediately covered her mouth. She looked around and whispered, "If a slave runs away and is caught, they will be killed. Then run away and find a place they can't find. There are many wild animals in the forest, and we don't have the ability to survive in the wild." Nancy lowered her head and said, "It would be great if she had a strong body like the men." Susu's eyes were full of thoughts, and a thought gradually came to her mind. After waking up every day, Alex would lead the warriors of the tribe to hunt, and then at night he would go to the slave hold to extract Susu. At first, Susu was a bit reluctant, but later on, seeing that this person didn't even touch her, it didn't matter anymore. She struggled and resisted before, but it was useless. Every time the man looked at her with a pet-like gaze, as if his kitten was angry in front of its owner, with a carefree attitude towards it. Boom boom boom. A loud noise echoed in the night sky, and in an instant, dense raindrops fell. Susu huddled at the corner of the bed, startled by the thunder. Alex, who had just returned from the river by the bedside, would take a shower and get on the bed after several hunting trips. When he heard the thunder, the man casually threw the coarse cloth on the nearby stone slab and lay down by the bed. Susu closed her eyes and prayed from the bottom of her heart that the night would pass quickly. The sound of rain outside the cave drifted towards Susu, who was lying on the bed with her head buried in her lap. She didn't notice the man beside the bed quietly leaning over. Alex raised his hand and touched her soft long hair. He lowered his eyelids and felt her trembling all along. "Are you afraid of me?" Susu pursed her lips, keeping her head down. The disgust and annoyance that flashed in her eyes were also well hidden. For a moment, she felt like she was being held in her arms, her cheeks pressed against the warm and sturdy chest of the other person, and this posture became somewhat intimate. Susu's ear tips have turned red, and even if she doesn't like it, being held by a stranger like this, male hormones tightly surround her, and her heart inevitably beats faster. She wanted to push away, but as soon as she thought about Hansen's fate, she didn't dare to speak in an instant. Alex also felt a little emotional in his heart. The sound of rain outside the window seemed to have become a catalyst. He lowered his head and lightly kissed the girl's back neck, causing the girl in his arms to tremble uncontrollably. The aroma became even more intense. Unable to resist, Alex bit her neck. The pain hit, and Susu suddenly pushed him away. Alex's mouth was still bloodshot, and he looked at her with deep eyebrows and eyes. Susu didn't dare to speak, she just silently accused him. For a moment, the man's thin lips lightly parted and said, "I hurt you." Susu retreated to the corner of the wall and ignored him. Time flies, and in the blink of an eye, a few more days have passed. This morning, when Susu woke up, she saw many people standing on the tribal square, and Alex and the others were also there. Originally, today is a trade fair. Many tribes have come to the Monte tribe to exchange supplies. Susu was not interested in the trade fair and was about to leave when she saw Nancy's figure. Nancy was held in the arms of a tall and muscular man with a happy expression on his face, and his salty hands touched Nancy's shoulder. Susu could tell at a glance that Nancy was forced and didn't like this man. The girl's eyes widened as she slowly walked over. Alex grabbed her wrist when he saw her walking over. The leader of the White Feather clan, who was holding the man Nancy, saw Susu and his eyes lit up. He asked, "Your Highness, is this?" Alex said coldly, "My wife." The leader of the White Feather tribe dared not look too much at the moment. Montessori men have a strong possessiveness towards their partners and do not allow others to care about their women. After the trade fair, Susu pulled Nancy to the riverbank and said, "You." Nancy smiled and took the initiative to embrace the girl in front of her, whispering in her ear, "I'm so happy. The leader of the White Feather clan exchanged 20 animal skins for me. Susu. Is this something worth celebrating?" Nancy was still saying in her ear, "I never thought I was so valuable." Susu had nothing to say. She didn't quite understand the concept of 20 animal skins, but seeing that Nancy had no intention of feeling sad, she didn't need to say anything more. Nancy rubbed against the soft little person in her arms and said in a muffled voice, "I can't bear to part with you." Susu also felt a bit uncomfortable, and her only friend in this world was about to leave her. "I will miss you." At night after Alex returned, he had a gloomy expression on his face. His body pressure was very low, and Susu silently kept away from him. The man was sulking alone until the girl next to him fell asleep before taking her into his arms. The next day, Susu looked at the clear marks on her arm and felt a bit confused. When did she hit it? After Nancy left the Monte tribe, Susu began to go out with the slaves to pick every day. She couldn't stand the grilled meat and ate the fruits when she was hungry. Until she fainted without any warning. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. The shaman of the Monte tribe is named Cain. Cain lives in a cave not far from the center of the tribe, and on the wooden frame next to his cave are herbs picked from the Malone forest this morning. He has nothing to do today and finally has time to study the gift sent by the leader a while ago. He was pondering where to start when he heard someone outside the cave shouting, "Master Witch Doctor, Master Witch Doctor." Cain put down his stone knife and slowly walked out. Bruce quickly ran to the witch doctor with Susu in his arms and said anxiously, "Master Witch Doctor, take a look at what's wrong with her. She suddenly fainted while picking." Cain touched his beard and said, "Put her on the stone bed." Yes. The young girl on the stone bed had an incredibly beautiful face and a much thinner and shorter body than the tribe members. Cain looked at her pale lips and then stood up to take a bowl of black and red medicine. He handed Bruce, "Feed her." Bruce carefully took it and helped Susu up. He poured the bowl into her mouth with one hand, but it all spilled out. The girl in his arms was soft and boneless, with a faint aroma permeating the air. Bruce quietly turned red in his ears, touched the girl's lips, opened them, and poured them in. Susu was awakened by choking, and when she looked up, she saw the man's resolute face. There were many withered flowers and plants piled up in the corner of the cave. She calmed down, but her head still felt a bit dizzy. She slowly stood up and saw an old man in a white robe, holding several packets of medicinal powder in his hand. He handed it to Bruce and instructed, "Drink one bowl every day until you finish." "Yes. Master Witch Doctor." The two of them walked out of the witch doctor's cave and only then realized that the sun was about to set. Susu looked up at the man beside her and whispered, "Thank you." Bruce frowned and smiled as he gazed into the girl's clear and transparent eyes, then awkwardly scratched his head and said, "It's a small matter." As the two of them spoke, Bruce's expression suddenly became serious. A hint of doubt flashed in Sue Suxing's eyes as she turned around and saw Alex strode over. The tall figure of the man gradually approached. He had just returned from hunting, and the sweat on his body slightly wetted his clothes. His handsome face was covered in a layer of cold frost. His eyes scanned the two of them lightly, sharp and with a hint of displeasure. Alex stood in front of Susu. Bruce handed over the medicine powder on his hand and said, "Leader, this is the prescription that the shaman has prescribed for Susu. 1 bowl a day." The man let out a soft and took the medicine powder, then hugged Susu and left here. Tonight, Susu ate 2 wild fruits and went to the river to wash up. The bright full moon hangs high in the sky, and the warm and gentle summer night breeze caresses people's faces. Not far away, the Monte people are joking and playing, and children run carefree on this grassland. Susu lowered her head and silently washed her arms, when suddenly a sound of footsteps came from behind. She stopped her movements and didn't look back. The person jumped directly into the river and threw the coarse cloth wrapped around their body onto Susu's head. The warm and masculine coarse cloth directly covered her forehead, and this thing was a close-fitting garment wrapped around the man's lower body, not separated by underwear. Susu took off the cloth from her head and threw it on the ground. She was a bit angry and said, "What are you doing?" The girl's fair face was adorned with 2 blushes, and due to anger, her clear black eyes became even brighter. Alex casually glanced at her and said, "Wash it clean." Susu was angry when she saw his confident and righteous appearance and said, "Why? I don't care." The man stared at her coldly without saying a word, his tall and sturdy figure approaching Susu, an invisible overwhelming sense of oppression. Susu was a bit hesitant. She lowered her eyes and said with a hint of flattery in her voice, "I'm joking, I'll wash it now." Alex stopped and stood in the small river, rinsing his body. The night is getting deeper and deeper in the pitch-black cave. The girl lay stiff on the stone bed, staring at the top of the cave with wide eyes. The man beside her seemed to be asleep. The atmosphere suddenly became somewhat quiet, and outside the cave came the constant chirping of insects. Susu rolled over and turned her back to him. In a moment, her waist tightened and she was carried into her sturdy and broad arm. She shook it away from the man's body. The man's deep and hoarse voice rang in his ear. "Sue! Sue!" Susu heard him call her name and her eyelids suddenly twitched. "What's wrong?" Alex slowly approached and held her little hand to his chest, saying, "Alex." Originally, it was a name exchange. He only found out her name today. The heart under her palm thumped wildly, and the rough and hot hand of the man on the back of his hand pressed tightly against her. A hint of panic flashed in Susu's eyes. She wanted to pull her hand back, but she didn't pull it out. He took the opportunity to pull it into her arms. The man pressed his chin against the top of her hair, and a complex emotion appeared in his deep green eyes, which was incomprehensible. Susu rolled her eyes inwardly, feeling that this person had a split personality disorder, which was good and bad to her. She had previously threatened her with a corpse, and in the blink of an eye, she could affectionately call out her name. When the first ray of sunlight in the morning slipped into the cave, Alex opened his eyes and looked down at the girl in his arms. She was sleeping obediently, her hair slightly messy against her face, her cheeks pink, and her lips unconsciously slightly open, revealing a little bit of teeth. The girl was wearing a white long dress, with 2 slender and pure white arms exposed, and below was her curvy and beautiful waist. Alex looked a little hot-eyed as he lightly caressed her shoulder with his palm and bit her collarbone. Susu woke up from pain, frowned tightly, opened her eyes, and saw a golden hair. She immediately grabbed the person's hair and pulled it back. She used all her strength with pale fingers to make his head move away from her. The man's green eyes stared straight at her face, with a hot and slightly crazy look. Susu placed her hand on her chest, her eyes filled with fear, and tears appeared in her eyes. She trembled and said, "Go. Stay away." The crisp and pleasant tone carries a clear sense of panic, with no trace of intimidation. Alex slowly stood up and left the cave. Susu, who stayed on the stone bed, breathed a sigh of relief. She wiped her collarbone and felt it was still not clean. She went to the river to wash it again. Today, Susu didn't go with her to the Marone forest to pick, she went alone to the back mountain of the tribe. Passing through the lush hillside, Susu arrived at the edge of a cliff. She sat on a stone and watched the sun and mist surrounding the mountains in the sky. The howling wind blew up from the bottomless cliff, and the girl's dress fluttered up, as if she would sail away in the next second. She was lost in thought, having been in this world for over a month now, with no clue of returning home. The tooth marks on the collarbone haven't disappeared yet. The man's patience with her gradually dissipated, and sometimes his gaze towards her was revealing and crazy. What should she do? As the sun grew older, Susu stayed for a while before walking down the mountain. Before the sun set, Susu finally walked to the entrance of the tribe. The guard at the doors saw her and immediately reported to the leader, while the other Montes surrounded her. Susu looked at the crowd in confusion and asked softly, "What's wrong?" The crowd automatically left a small path, and the man walked out from behind. He said in a cold and stern voice, "Lock her up." End of this chapter. Chapter 8. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Susu was imprisoned. She was locked in a dark underground cave, and every night Alex would bring her grilled meat. She cursed, screamed, and begged for mercy, but it was useless. That person always looked cold and heartless, standing at the entrance of the cave and watching her leave for a while. Susu didn't understand why she was locked up. Until that night, Alex opened the door of the underground cave. The moonlight shines on the land, leaving behind a silver-white patch. Susu squatted in the corner, watching the tall figure gradually approaching and the person looking down at her. Susu hugged her chest with both hands, her eyes devoid of color. When the person touched her body, a disgusted expression appeared on her face. "Don't touch me." Alex remained silent as he grabbed the girl's neck and pulled her up. "Susu hasn't eaten anything for the past 2 days." She stood up suddenly, her eyes turning black, and she almost fell. Alex carried her directly onto his shoulder and headed back to the cave. The man placed her on the stone bed, picked up the barbecue, and handed it to her. Susu didn't answer in a moment. Alex picked up a wild fruit from the side and handed it to her. Susu still hasn't responded. He took an expressionless bite of the grilled meat and then prepared to personally feed it to her. The girl finally had a reaction and turned her head to avoid it. "I'll do it myself," she said, picking up the wild fruit next to her and nibbling on it. Alex asked, "Did you go to the back mountain that day?" He didn't see her figure when he came back from hunting, and later asked the tribe members, but they didn't know either. As the people around him came and went, Alex felt extremely restless in his heart. He turned around and went to the slave hole, only to find that the girl did not follow him to pick today, and a sense of powerlessness surged in his heart. Alex immediately ordered the tribe to search for her figure, but after searching around the tribe, no one was seen. The hostility in his eyes grew stronger, and he began to regret allowing her to freely enter and exit the tribe. Pets should be kept in captivity. The man waited for a long time but didn't receive a reply. He frowned and said sternly, "Speak up." Susu was startled to the point where she felt angry and immediately said in a polite tone, "Yes." "Does it have anything to do with you?" "She really cares a lot." The man heard her words and smiled faintly, taking a step forward. Upon seeing this, Susu immediately ran towards the outside of the cave. Halfway back, he was caught. The man lowered his head and bit his sharp teeth on her shoulder, this time with extreme force. In an instant, blood flowed down the girl's slender arm. What a crazy dog! Susu couldn't bear it any longer, and the pain on her shoulders was pouring in. She began to struggle frantically. The next second, she was tightly hugged by her arms, her legs still being held by him, and her limbs had nowhere to stretch, like a lamb being slaughtered, waiting for the butcher's bayonet. Alex saw the girl in his arms calm down before he stopped moving and said, "As long as you listen, I will treat you well." Susu blinked her eyes and tears instantly blurred her vision. She knew it was no use crying, but in the end, she held back. Silent all night afterwards, Susu was restricted from her freedom, and as soon as she left Alex's cave, she would be followed by someone. Alex arranged for 2 warriors from the tribe to guard her. The 2 warriors who monitor Susu are tough-faced and muscular in stature. Susu was followed by them as soon as she left the cave entrance, with the 2 of them following behind her on either side. After washing up, she prepared to go to the forest with a backpack to pick, but was stopped by the two of them. Susu had no choice but to return the same way and sat by the river, staring blankly. Under the scorching sun, there are no clouds for thousands of miles, and the fat fish in the river pool swim leisurely among them. The people of the Monte tribe do not like to eat fish, so the fish in this river are very plump in size. The girl blinked her eyes and suddenly a thought came to her mind. She took off her shoes and picked up the backpack beside her, jumping into the river. Her action frightened the two people behind her, and they quickly stepped forward to find the girl standing steadily by the river. Only then did they breathe a sigh of relief. The pool water was a bit deep, submerging her knees. Susu held her skirt in one hand and her backpack in the other, staring intently at the chubby fish in the water. The two Montes on the shore exchanged a glance and then jumped into the river to protect her safety. In no time, a black fish brushed against Susu's leg. She immediately held her breath and quietly grabbed the basket with her fingers, quickly salvaged it, and then landed. The two people behind them saw a hint of doubt in their eyes. They didn't understand why the girl was fishing for these big fish. Grilled fish meat is difficult to eat and has many thorns. Once, a brave Montessori warrior was bitten by a hard thorn in his throat while eating grilled fish, causing him to lose his life. Later on, people dared not eat these big fish anymore. The fish in the basket left the surface of the water and began to struggle, bouncing around. Susu almost missed it. She found a slate and then tapped the fish's head, finally calming down. Susu accidentally looked up and found these two people looking at her in surprise. She smiled shyly and then lowered her head to look for a branch to start a fire. The method of drilling wood to start a fire is a bit too slow. The girl touched her chin and asked the two people next to her, "Is there any spark?" The girl had clear black eyes and a soft tone. One of the guards blushed and replied, "Yes, I'll go get it." Susu smiled and thanked, "Could you please?" The other Montessori who stayed in place quietly went to the side and picked up some branches to come back. Pipa. The burning red twig suddenly fell to the ground, and the fish meat had been roasted to a golden and soft white, with a faint fish aroma permeating the air. Susu spread the leaves on the ground, then divided the grilled fish into 3 parts with branches and handed them to the two people. There was some hesitation on both faces, but in the end, they accepted this offer. Susu took a sip of the fish without any seasoning, but it was smooth and tender, light and delicious, giving it a unique flavor. She finished eating all the fish and meat on her hand. The two Montessori people saw that Susu had not shown any signs of fainting or pain, so they carefully picked out the fish bones before mustering up the courage to taste them and then began to eat them in large gulps. The fish skin is crispy and the fish meat is delicious, even more delicious than grilled meat. Susu reminded them as they wolfed down, "Be careful of thorns." The two nodded and resolved the fish chunks on their hands. The girl sat on the ground and said, "Do you have salt? If you add some salt to the barbecue, it will be more fragrant and delicious." The two of them sounded a bit moved, but what is salt? Seeing their bewildered faces, Susu explained, "It's white, not right. It should be a beige stone that hasn't been extracted yet. It tastes salty and salty. Eating too much makes people want to drink water." After shaking their heads, a hint of disappointment flashed in her eyes and she said, "Okay." She has been on this continent for over a month now, eating fruits every day. Occasionally, Alex forces her to drink some broth, and she really wants to improve her diet. The meat roasted by the people in the tribe always carries bloodstains from the prey, and Susu doesn't take it lightly. She doesn't like to eat raw food. The afternoon passed by in a flash, and in the blink of an eye, the moon appeared again in the night sky. Susu lay on the stone bed listening to the laughter of people outside the cave. She didn't know that this afternoon's grilled fish made her famous in front of everyone in the tribe. The two guards spoke passionately about how delicious the grilled fish she made was. The tribe members sat together in groups of 3 or 2, and some people expressed complete disbelief upon hearing these words. Have you had grilled fish today? Can her slender arms and legs catch fish? Stop teasing, okay? Not to mention, that big fish took the initiative to run into the girl's backpack. Alex listened calmly to the discussion below the steps, and suddenly a picture came to his mind. A girl standing in the pool, looking helplessly at the lively schools of fish, with nowhere to take action. The man let out a light cough, and he was captivated by his own imagination. The Montes immediately fell silent when they heard their leader speak, but when they looked up, they saw the leader pulling the corners of his mouth and looking very happy. It wasn't until midnight that the crowd dispersed. After Alex returned to the cave, he noticed the delicate figure on the stone bed. He threw the coarse cloth off his body and, naked, climbed onto the stone bed. With a big hand, he grabbed it and the beautiful woman fell into his arms. Susu had already opened her eyes when the man went to bed. The man had a high body temperature, a sturdy chest, and a faint male hormone wafting in the air. Susu folded her chin and retreated away from his chest. Alex hugged her slender waist with both hands, his tone gentle, and a slight smile in his eyes, saying, "Did you grill fish this afternoon?" The man lowered his head and sniffed at the scent on her, dominating his voice, "I'll catch you fish tomorrow when I come back from hunting. Whatever you want." Susu's eyelashes trembled lightly, and a hint of surprise flashed through her eyes before she spoke again. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. The next afternoon, Alex returned from hunting with his tribe and went to catch fish for Susu. At this moment, the people of the Monte tribe were lighting a fire and preparing dinner. Someone noticed the leader fishing for black fish and exclaimed in surprise. The summer evening breeze carried the scent of green grass in the forest. Susu sat on the ground, looking blankly at the man in the river. The basket next to her was already filled with fish. The man with broad shoulders and narrow waist, his thick wheat-colored arms stroked into the river and grabbed a big fish. His heroic sword eyebrows spread out, and his previously sharp green eyes flickered with a faint smile. His expression seemed somewhat proud, and he grabbed the unconscious black fish with his big hands and went ashore. Alex put the fish in the basket and whispered, "Are these enough? If they're not enough, I'll go catch them." Susu nodded and then found a match to start the fire. The man sat on the nearby ground and began dissecting the fish's internal organs, then prepared to skewer it onto the branches and start grilling. "Don't you scale the fish?" Upon hearing the girl's questioning voice, Alex looked up and said in confusion, "What?" Susu patted the dust on her hand and walked over to Alex, whispering, "The hard scales on the surface of the big fish need to be scraped off, otherwise the meat will be difficult to chew. It's like this, there's no knife here, so we can only take this for now." This was the first time the girl had spoken a lot of words calmly to him. A faint fragrance permeated the air, reminiscent of those around me. The soft words of the girl in my ear gradually faded away, becoming somewhat unreal. Alex's gaze slowly fell on her red lips, with a few teeth hidden behind them, faintly visible. Alex licked his dry lips, then lowered his head to take the slate from the girl's hand and began scraping fish scales. Susu saw that he was getting started quite quickly, and a hint of relief flashed in her eyes before she went to add some firewood. The man had a strong hand and quickly scraped off all the fish scales, and then he started grilling the fish. Neither of them spoke, and the atmosphere became somewhat quiet for a moment. Alex remained silent and Susu didn't take the initiative to find a topic. She lowered her head and started drawing on the ground with a branch in her hand. "I miss my phone now." After an unknown amount of time, the man's deep voice rang out, "All right." Susu looked up and saw that the fish in his hand had been roasted to a scorching aroma. Alex put the grilled fish aside to cool off, and when it wasn't too hot, he handed it to Susu. Susu lowered her eyebrows and said, "Thank you." The two of them had a full meal and then went to the stream to wash up one after the other. Under the moonlight, the young girl quietly washed her hands and face. Her cheeks were already wet with hair, and her rosy and charming little face was even more dazzling and charming in the moonlight. Her almond eyes and nose were radiant, and her rosy and delicate lips were slightly closed. She focused on cleaning the dust from her body, not noticing that the man in front of her was staring at her with a deep gaze. After a moment, Susu turned around and saw that the man had already stood by the stream, as if waiting for her. He held his forehead with his hand, his golden short hair still carrying droplets of water. At this moment, his eyes were slightly closed, and under his sturdy and powerful waist, there was only a damp coarse cloth hanging in the span that could not fall off. Alex noticed the girl's gaze and looked over. His Adam's apple rolled and he whispered, "What are you doing there? Come over." Susu was stunned for a moment, and she obediently stood over with her eyelids down. The distance between the two was only 5 meters, and she walked towards him step by step. Alex watched as his fair and delicate face slowly approached, his excited pupils dilated slightly. As she approached, he suddenly turned around and walked into the cave. At some point, dark clouds covered the cave, and the sound of pattering rain suddenly sounded. The whirring raindrops drifted into the cave. Alex on the stone bed was not drowsy at all, and his mind was filled with the figure of a young girl. He turned his head and glanced at the girl at the corner of the bed. She arched her waist slightly and hugged her arms, with long hair draped behind her head, revealing only her flawless white neck. Her slender body was wrapped in a long dress, giving off a look of not being close to strangers. Alex suddenly felt that his image of wanting to approach but not daring to approach her was somewhat ridiculous. What had he been worrying about these past few days? He reached out and touched the girl's back. Seeing that she didn't react, he leaned in directly. Susu felt a warm touch coming from her back, and as the person leaned in, her thoughts suddenly snapped. The man reached out and hugged her tightly, his lips intentionally or unintentionally kissing her long hair. Susu felt her blood freeze all over her body, and her brain went blank. When she realized it, she immediately pushed him and hurriedly said, "No way." Alex's gaze sank as he was about to speak when he suddenly smelled a bloody smell. He immediately sat up and said, "Are you injured?" Susu. Yes. I'm feeling a bit unwell. Where are you feeling uncomfortable? He said as he was about to get his hands checked. Susu quickly dodged over, but at this moment, her stomach suddenly felt a throbbing pain, and there were faint bloodstains flowing out from under her body. Isn't it? At this time, Alex immediately got out of bed and wrapped himself in a coarse cloth, saying, "Wait for me here." The man's figure quickly disappeared into the rain curtain. Susu on the bed hugged her belly with an unattainable expression. What should Aunt do at this time? End of this chapter. Chapter 10. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. The sound of rain flowing along the stone walls into the cave, and in a moment, a small patch of water appeared on the ground. In the heavy rain, the man ran quickly into the cave, holding a package tightly in his arms, and then strode to the bedside. With a loud bang, in an instant, purple light illuminated the cave, and Susu lifted her eyes to see his arms soaked in rain. The man put the package on his hand in front of her and said, "The witch doctor said you're not sick, you're in heat. This is clean animal skin, you can use it first." Susu looked at the pile of fabric on the bed, and the man threw the wet cloth onto the slate, saying, "Can't you use it? The girl may have just reached adulthood, and no one taught her to use these things." Thinking about this, Alex's eyes flashed with a hint of pity. The man grinned his white teeth and joked, "I'll teach you." Susu took a step back and avoided his outstretched hand, her voice muffled as she said, "I'll do it myself, you carry it over." Alex raised his eyebrows, "So you're guarding him?" Afterwards, he slowly turned around. Susu picked up a piece of animal skin, then turned her back to him and lifted the hem of her skirt. The animal skin beneath her was smooth, soft and tightly pressed against the roots of her thighs. After Susu put it on, she dared not move around. She was afraid that if she didn't pay attention, it would fall out. She lay stiff on the stone bed. "All right." Alex turned around at the sound and picked up a coarse cloth from the nearby slate to wipe away the water droplets on his body. He then lay down on the stone bed and closed his eyes. That night, Susu slept very restlessly, with occasional drops and pains in her lower abdomen. The howling wind blew wildly into the cave, causing Susu to shiver all over from the cold. Feeling drowsy, she tugged at her nerves and eventually couldn't bear it and fell asleep. Alex looked at the girl at the corner of the bed, sighed, and slowly leaned over. In the early morning after rain, the mountains were shrouded in mist, and the land was still slightly damp. The emerald-green leaves were covered with crystal-clear water droplets, and children under the ancient trees were playful and playful. The Monte people who came and went stood in front of the cave, tidying up the food residue on the ground. After the physiological period came, Susu didn't want to move. She collapsed on the stone bed, with aching waist and abdomen. Somehow she missed her hometown's mobile phone, milk tea, spicy hot pot and her rental cabin she has been missing for so many days, and I don't know if anyone has found her. It should be none. Alex didn't go hunting today. He went to the witch doctor and asked for many clean animal skins. The number of women in the Monte tribe is rare and precious. Every time they are in heat, they go to the witch doctor to collect clean and comfortable animal skins. This kind of animal skin used during the estrus period is sterilized and fumigated by shamanists and herbs, which can alleviate the pain when women bleed. In order to reproduce, the men of the Monte tribe would snatch women from other tribes, and these snatched women became common female slaves of the tribe. Only after giving birth to the offspring of the Monte tribe can they break free from slavery. For several days in a row, Susu spent most of her time in bed. After her menstrual cycle ended, she went to the river to take a shower. As soon as she left the cave door, she saw the two guards who had been monitoring her the other day. Susu nodded lightly and greeted her. She had noticed before that all the women in the tribe were bathing in this small stream. In the evening, groups of Montessori women were chatting and laughing by the creek. As they approached the creek, the two guards stopped and remained in place with hesitation on their faces. At this moment, a woman had already noticed them. The woman was naked and didn't care about walking away. With a charming expression, she poured a basin of stream water at the two guards. Two people dodged sideways. Susu watched them pluck some leaves from the bushes beside them, rub them in the palm of her hand, and soon foam came out. Then the women smeared foam on their bodies. Susu also picked a few branches and leaves, found a hidden place, and then rubbed the mud off her body in the nearby forest. There were occasional roars of wild beasts, and Susu quickly cleaned her body before changing into a long skirt on the slate. When she returned to the center of the tribe, she found that Alex had already hunted back with those warriors. The ethnic people sat under the ancient tree, preparing dinner for tonight. Bruce was reporting today's picking situation to the leader when he suddenly noticed that the leader's gaze was resolute as he looked ahead. A hint of doubt flashed in Bruce's eyes, and he followed the leader's gaze. The girl under the tree was dressed in a white dress, with her long hair casually draped behind her. Her fair and delicate face was slightly pink, and she was staring down at the ground with her eyes down. She didn't know what she was thinking, and a hemp rope was casually tied to her waist, making her look even more plump than a grip. Surrounded by chaos, only she stood quietly on the side, slightly lonely. Yes, she has no family or friends in her tribe. Bruce's eyes were taken aback, and Alex beside him had already walked towards the girl. The tall and handsome man leaned down and whispered a few words in the girl's ear. The next second, Bruce saw the girl immediately take a step back, staring at the man in front of him with a red face. At this moment, the sense of alienation on the girl's body was shattered. Bruce suddenly came up with a word, matching, in his mind. He looked at the two of them with determination, then scratched the back of his head and left. Alex felt a bit regretful in his heart, with a pair of green eyes fixed on the girl. He couldn't control himself just now and used foul language in front of her, which scared him so much that he wanted to escape from here. Susu's face turned red with anger, and she quietly moved to the side. Why is he so rude? A few minutes ago Susu lowered her head and suddenly felt herself shrouded in a shadow. She looked up and saw the man with drooping eyelids, staring deeply at her. Her green eyes were as deep as a deep pool, and she didn't dare to look much. She quickly shifted her gaze. My waist is thin and I'll fold it in just a few strokes. A deep and hoarse male voice blew into her ear, and the overwhelming pressure instantly made Susu's pupils shrink. When she realized it, she immediately moved away from this person, afraid that he would do something wrong to her. Afterwards, Alex saw the girl leave here like a frightened bird. He was taken aback for a moment, then quickly followed suit. A few days later, Alex found herself hiding from him. During the day, he wanted to go hunting. When Susu saw him in the evening, she ran away. At night, in the cave, the two of them collapsed and slept together. Alex wanted to communicate, but couldn't get any answer. On that day, Susu woke up and went to the melon forest, followed by the two guards. The two of them didn't stop her from leaving the tribe. It seems that Alex told them something. On the way, Susu carried a basket on her back and went directly to the place where she had picked wild fruits before. Susu doesn't know how to climb trees. She directly picked the fruit in front of her and then searched for other food nearby. Those two people followed behind her, one on the left and one on the right, vigilantly watching the wind and grass around them. The emperor does not disappoint those who have intentions. Susu discovered a potato-like food in the midst of a patch of weeds. Her eyes lit up and she dug out the things in the field. The earthy yellow outer skin has an irregular oval shape, and Susu excitedly cuts open the thin layer of skin with her fingers. Unexpectedly, the inside is white. Potatoes belong to the Solanaceae family and are perennial herbaceous tuberous vegetables. They are rich in starch and nutrients, and most importantly, they have high yields. With them, you don't have to go hungry. The girl's apricot eyes became increasingly bright, and she excitedly dug along this stem twice, instantly adding a few more potatoes. Afterwards, Susu carried a basket full of potatoes back to the tribe. Although the two people behind her didn't understand why she was digging these things, they also took a few potatoes back to the tribe. In the evening, Susu tasted roasted potatoes. She saw the two people next to her staring at her, and then shared the remaining roasted potatoes with them. She has a small vegetarian appetite and is full after taking 2 bites. The two of them saw that the black thing on the ground looked like a lump of soil, and then learned to be vegetarian. They broke open the potatoes, and a soft, sticky, sweet smell wafted in the air. One of them took a bite and asked, "What is this?" The taste was a bit strange and easy to chew, with a soft texture. Potatoes. Afterwards, the two of them shared these roasted potatoes with the people in the tribe. Everyone saw a black one that remained motionless. What is this thing? Can it be eaten? Potatoes, Lee and I have already eaten them. Do you think this was done by that exotic woman? How did she know that? Potatoes could be eaten. Maybe they have this kind of food in their tribe, and people from big tribes eat it delicately. When Susu first arrived at the tribe, everyone noticed the nightgown she was wearing. It was exquisitely crafted and had an unheard of style, as well as her pristine and flawless skin, stunning everyone's faces. Everyone discussed which tribe she belonged to, but after thinking about more than a dozen tribes around her, they couldn't guess. After a few seconds of silence, someone picked up a roasted potato. Lee was one of the people monitoring Susu. When he saw his tribe members picking up roasted potatoes, he immediately said, "Break it open and eat the beige one inside." The person followed suit and slowly took a bite to comment, "The taste is a bit strange." After a few people tried it one after another, they received a rating of peculiar taste, slightly sweet, while others felt that roasted potatoes had a sandy texture. After this incident, the people in the tribe all knew that Susu was making strange dishes. Everyone was a bit curious. End of this chapter.